Stoughton Media Access Corporation is pleased to present International Forum, a new cable show of interest, periodically interviewing foreign newsmakers, bringing them from across the ocean directly to your living room. Here's your host for this week's show, Wayne Pomianski.
Hello and welcome to International Forum. I am Wayne Pomianski and delighted to be the host for today's program. The world, of course, is focused on events unfolding in Syria, the involvement of Russia, the United States, and we thought this would be an extremely good time to invite back one of the experts on the Middle East that's joined us on International Forum for a number of shows this year. And for those of you who are frequent viewers, of course, you know I'm referring to Yoram Ettinger, former Israeli Minister for Congressional Affairs at Israel's embassy in Washington, D.C., where he served with the rank of ambassador. His expertise spans U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East politics, demography and population fluxes and fallacies in the Middle East, as well as overseas investments in Israel's high-tech arena. And as I welcome Yoram back to our program, of course, I want to make note of the fact that many of our viewers and staff members observed the Jewish New Year on September 4th. So Yoram, Happy New Year and welcome back to International Forum. Good to see you again today.
Thank you, and Happy New Year to everyone on the other side of the ocean.
Thank you very much. We will be focusing, of course, a lot of our program today on the events in Syria. And I think maybe we'll just set a little bit of a context, and I want to get your opinion on what you envision or what you see actually occurring in Syria right now. Of course, the world, I would say, the civilized world anyhow, was absolutely horrified from the events of August 21st, when chemical weapons were deployed in Syria against the population. We know from news reports that over 1,000 people were killed, of which 400 or more were children. We've seen the videos of folks under the influence of the chemical weapons. The United States, after it looked at various forms of evidence, concluded that the use of the chemical weapons was by the Bashar Assad regime. Assad has, on numerous occasions, first declined to even admit that he had chemical weapons in Syria, and he attributed the use of the chemical weapons to the forces that are arrayed against his government. He refers to them as terrorists. I think here in the United States, our administration thinks of those forces more as rebels that are disenchanted with the 40-year rule of the Assad family and are fighting for change. So lots of different perspectives in terms of what's happening in Syria. Of course, as we get into today's program, we'll be talking about the so-called Russian proposal. But before we get to that point, as a very knowledgeable observer of events in the Middle East, what's your take in terms of what's happening in Syria these days?
Well, in Syria, we have a struggle, which is typical of the Arab Middle East. Struggle over power, and the struggle is the ethnic and geographic and geological and religious, and probably just like other such struggles on the chaotic Arab street, this one too is insoluble in the long run. The difference between this struggle and some of the others is that it also involves some non-conventional weaponry, which should not be in the hands, should not be accessible to rogue organizations and rogue regimes. The free world cannot tolerate chemical, biological warfare, let alone nuclear warfare, in the hands of either Assad regime or Muslim Brotherhood or Al Qaeda, which oppose him, because chemical, biological infrastructure in the hands of either one of those options, Assad, Al Qaeda, or Muslim Brotherhood, would simply mean a lethal threat, to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and other Arab oil-producing countries, which are very vital for the U.S. economy, for the price of oil and supply of oil. Such weaponry in Syria would accelerate the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East and beyond. And most importantly for the U.S., chemical, biological, military infrastructure in the hands of rogue regimes in Syria would become pretty accessible to the numerous anti-American Islamic terror organizations which operate in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East, and beyond, all the way to scores of sleeper cells in the U.S. And therefore, in my mind, it is a very clear and present danger to vital American interests, and it's incumbent upon the free world to prevent such access to rogue regimes.
Of course, the United States, as I had mentioned in our intro, paused for a little while to take a look at the evidence, satellite information, using sophisticated detection that we have as one of our strategic capabilities, subsequently accused the Assad regime of deploying the chemical weapons. There in Jerusalem, of course, you're quite knowledgeable of what's happening in Israel. Has Israel joined in the chorus of accusations against Assad in terms of who was actually responsible for deploying the chemical weapons, or has Israel pretty much stayed on the sidelines in this particular case?
Well, it seems to me that it's completely irrelevant who was using it. The relevant fact, which no one can deny, is that there is in Syria, there is an infrastructure of chemical and biological warfare. This must not be tolerated by the free world for the reasons I mentioned before. And therefore, it is incumbent upon the free world to act, and inaction in face of such reality would deliver a blow, further blow, to the posture of deterrence which has been eroded, that posture of deterrence of the U.S. and the free world, and it would mean a tailwind to Iran's megalomaniac aspirations to become nuclear. For the U.S. to refrain from action against Syria would aggravate situation with Iran, which is much, much more important than Syria. Iran is the source, Syria is the derivative. At this stage, especially in view of the U.S. embracing the Russian proposal, the folks in Tehran feel pretty relieved, as do the folks in Moscow, Beijing, North Korea, and other rogue capitals of the world.
And we'll be talking about the Russian proposal. Of course, we're taping our program on Thursday, September 12th, the day when U.S. Ambassador, Secretary of State John Kerry will be meeting sometime during the day with his counterpart from Russia and starting the negotiations in terms of what happens with this, what we believe is a huge stockpile, tons and tons of chemical weapons in Syria. But again, I'd like to stay a little bit longer focused on the internal conditions in Syria that form the foundation for for the aggression that's occurring there. You may have seen an interview earlier this week. We have a very prominent interviewer named Charlie Rose. He appears on the CBS TV network here in the U.S. as well as public broadcasting. He's had some sort of an interviewing, working relationship with Assad, and not sure how he was able to do it, but he was actually able to interview Assad on Sunday of this week, and it was a very interesting interview. I've seen the whole thing. And one of the things that Assad mentioned was, he was contrasting his situation in Syria, where he, claims his administration's been under attack for 2.5 years, with what's happened in Egypt and other countries in the Middle East. And he claims that he still has widespread public support of the Syrian people, and cites as evidence of that the fact that he's been able to withstand the resistance for 2.5 years, in that if he didn't have this support of the Syrian people, his regime would have toppled quickly, as Mubarak did in Egypt and so forth. So what's your thought as an observer of one of Israel's threatening neighbors, that being Syria? Do you think Assad, the 40 years of his family's rule of Syria, what do you see as the future for Syria? And you mentioned they're propped up by Iran. What do you think is going to happen going forward, notwithstanding the issue of chemical weapons?
Well, it seems to me that the future is very clear if we study the past. And the past shows us that which we see today is a symptom. It's symptomatic of the Middle East of the last 1400 years, which means this is the area of ethnic and geographic and religious and ideological fragmentation. This is an area of violent intolerance, of Muslim against Muslim, let alone Muslim against the so-called Christian or Jewish infidel in their midst. This is an area of unpredictability and instability, and this is an area of tenuous regimes and provisional policies. This is an area of agreements which are signed on ice and not carved in stone. And against that background, we also have the developments in Syria, as we have in Libya and Tunisia and Yemen and Egypt and Bahrain. And we have to be realistic. The question is, when will it also sweep through Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Abu Dhabi and Dubai? That type of reality is irrespective, independent of Israel, of the US, of the world at large. It's inherent endemic tragedy of the Arab Strait, of the chaotic, stormy Arab winter. And I think it was a mistake on the part of the US to get involved in the developments in Libya. US was smart enough not to get involved in Egypt, and the U.S. should not get involved in Syria. And when a person like me calls for surgical, determined military action against the chemical and biological military infrastructure in Syria, I do not imply, absolutely do not imply U.S. involvement on the side of either Assad or the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda, because the U.S. should stay out after obliterating the chemical, biological warfare infrastructure there. The struggle is not for the regime of Mr. Assad alone. This is a struggle which is different than the struggle in Tunisia or Libya or Egypt. It's a struggle of the Alawite community in Syria, which knows very well if Assad is defeated, they have to expect a massacre from the hands of the Sunni majority. And likewise, the Sunni majority, which is the bulk of the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Qaeda opposing Assad, they know very well if they lose, it's time for another massacre of the Sunni Muslims by the Alawites of Syria. This is the unfortunate reality of the vicious Middle East, and I do not see magic wand putting that to rest. I recall the unfortunate statements made by then Senator Kerry and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, where they welcomed Bashar Assad as a reformer, as a constructive leader, as a peaceful leader, and they considered Assad to be their buddy until the eruption of civil war in Syria some 2.5, 3 years ago. I remember the references in Washington about the Facebook revolution and the youth revolution and the democracy in transition on the streets of Egypt and Jordan and Libya and Syria, none of which, by the way, has anything to do with Middle East reality. It has to do with a very oversimplified world shaped by certain people in the Western world. And once again, I'm concerned that the same type of gullibility also has led the U.S. to embrace the delusional option of international inspection introduced by Russia. This has been so far a major Russian victory at the expense of the free world. Anybody who has any hopes in that option of international inspection should examine that option in working in North Korea and Iran, where it has failed and failed and failed, again for obvious reasons. And once again, Russia is introducing it in Syria. Unfortunately, at this stage, I hope for a few days, for a few weeks only, the U.S. has been trapped by that delusional option.
Your perception, I think, regarding the brutal events in the Middle East and how things have sort of segued from what was often referred to as the Arab Spring and now into the Arab Winter, is very consistent with an observation offered recently by one of our leading political scientists here in Massachusetts, a professor at Boston University named Andrew Bacevich, who was interviewed this week, and he offered the opinion that for 30 years the United States has been trying to quote-unquote fix the Middle East with not very good results. And he basically characterized the events in Syria and Egypt and Tunisia and Yemen and so forth as this brutal struggle for self-determination involving these factions, Alawites, Sunnis, Shiites, and so forth, and basically has said really the United States has virtually no influence to speak of in terms of the outcome in these nations, and it sounds like you would agree with that perception. Have I got that right?
Well, I certainly maintain that the U.S. should not get involved in civil wars in the Middle East, but the U.S., I think, would undermine its own interest with a hands-off policy when it comes to the Middle East at large. For instance, again, the potential access of rogue regimes to weapons of mass destruction, because the impact of Islamic terrorism is not confined anymore to an individual country or the Middle East. The impact of Islamic terrorism today is potentially or could potentially be felt in every single town or city anywhere in the world, including in the US. The impact of development of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East does have an impact on Venezuela, which is the backyard of the US and an adversary under the best circumstances, adversary, if not enemy, of the US. And from Venezuela to Boston, New York, it's not a major effort on the part of potential and actual terrorists. And certainly, the U.S. still has an interest in the price of oil, the flow of oil, orderly supply of oil from the Persian Gulf, as long as the U.S., as it is today, still imports some 36-37% of its energy requirements. Hopefully, the U.S. will shortly become energy independent, and that would be a major blow to rogue regimes anywhere in the world. It would be a major blessing to the U.S. independence of national security action. But at this stage, I believe the U.S., while having to refrain from involvement in civil wars, cannot detach itself from certain developments in the Middle East. Certainly cannot afford to subordinate reality to the whims of wishful thinking and delusional ambitions.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you that the United States must continue to be very, very involved with the goings-on in the Middle East for reasons that certainly go beyond our consumption of petroleum coming out of that region of the world. Just one more point on this interview with Bashar Assad involving Charlie Rose. I listened very closely to it, and Assad, asserted that the resistance that his regime is receiving is being supported by the West. He also blamed the resistance on the oil states in the Middle East. He mentioned Saudi Arabia specifically. He also contended that Turkey was involved in the resistance against his government. But I noticed he never mentioned Israel in that context. And I'm just wondering whether, again, Israel is staying kind of in the background insofar as these events involving Syria are unfolding. I don't recall anything in the media involving Israel condemning Syria for the use of chemical weapons or anything of that nature. So is Israel basically taking a hands-off approach at this point in time to what's happening in Syria?
Well, we certainly cannot afford to follow a hands-off policy anywhere in our region, and we have demonstrated that with Syria in 2007. We destroyed a nuclear reactor in Syria. We were not supported by most of the world. We were condemned by some countries in the world, but we did it. And I think today the world should send many thank you notes to Israel for destroying that nuclear reactor. Last year alone, we took on chemical warfare and advanced missiles 3 times in Syria, where we deemed it dangerous while being transported to the hands of Hezbollah and other rogue regimes in the area. When Assad speaks to his people, he does raise the issue of Israel, because that's how he generates more support among his people. When he speaks to American audience, he speaks reality, and he knows that Israel is absolutely not a player in the events in Syria. He knows very well that Israel does have a hands-on policy. He's not going to trigger any Israeli preemption or retaliation. And he knows very well that certain Arab countries are fighting against him. By the way, the Saudis, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Kuwait, etc., who support the anti-Assad terrorist elements in Syria, they do that. For them, it's protection money. They don't have any illusions, but they don't want those rogue elements, the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda. They don't want them to divert their fire at the House of Saud or Sheikh Sabah of Kuwait or Qatar or Bahrain, and therefore they buy their own safety by financing the war against Assad, which leads me again to highlight another very, very important miss or mistake by Secretary John Kerry, who recently at the House and Senate hearing referred to the moderate opposition in Syria. Well, he'll have to work very hard to develop a moderate opposition in Syria. There's no such thing in reality. It's either Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda, and both are Sharia-driven, both are anti-democratic, both follow an agenda which transcends Syria, both other Muslims, let alone the infidel. Assad today is faced by rogue regimes which make his rogue regime relatively moderate. And therefore, the US, the free world, are not faced with a good option versus bad option in Syria. The free world is faced with a bad option versus worse option versus the worst option. And between Assad on one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood or Al-Qaeda on the other hand, certainly from the point of view of the free world, Assad is not as bad because Assad's vision is confined to Syrian boundaries. The vision, the aims, immediate and long-term, of Al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood transcend Syria. They go through Jordan and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Persian Gulf and into the Western world. And therefore, the West should not, in my mind, provide any tailwind to the opposition to Assad. But at the same time, the West must not tolerate and must not be indifferent to the existence of non-conventional weapons of mass destruction on Syrian soil.
So to your point about the West not tolerating the use of these non-conventional weapons, it sounds to me like you agree with President Obama and some of the other political leaders here in the U.S., most notably Senator McCain, Senator Lindsey, of course, Secretary of State Kerry, who all have pretty much agreed that Assad crossed the so-called red line when using these weapons and must be punished. There's been a lot of discussion about a very surgical strike to at least cripple Assad's capability to deploy chemical weapons any longer. There is, I think it's safe to say here in the United States, a groundswell of popular opposition to getting involved in any kind of military engagement in Syria. Certainly not boots on the ground, but not even some sort of preemptive strike. I guess from your perspective there in Israel, if the United States did launch a military strike against Syria, what do you think the impact would be would be on Israel. Assad has said, you know, expect anything. What do you think would happen insofar as Israel is concerned?
Well, first of all, I totally disagree with Senator McCain and Senator Lindsey Graham or anybody in the administration, Secretary of State John Kerry, etc., who suggest a regime change in Syria. We know what happened in Iran when the U.S. got involved in a regime change, and rather than bringing along or ushering in a democratic regime, they facilitated the rise of the most anti-American regime in the world today, namely the Ayatollahs of Iran. We know what regime change did in Libya, more chaos, likewise in Tunisia, and certainly we know what regime change did in Egypt when Mubarak was toppled by the Muslim Brotherhood through what some call democratic election, which, by the way, is oxymoron. You cannot have democratic election in a non-democratic society. And certainly we know what will happen in Syria if Assad is toppled, because then the question is not whether a pro or anti-moderate regime will rise, but the question is whether it's going to be Muslim Brotherhood, as I assume, or Al-Qaeda supported regime. That should not be acceptable to the U.S. or to the rest of the free world. When it comes to Assad's threats on Israel, those are hollow threats. No one in the U.S. or in Israel should be concerned about it. Assad is not a suicide bomber. He knows exactly the Israeli reaction or retaliation to any of his action, and he's not going to commit suicide only to satisfy a few people in Syria. For Assad to challenge Israel would mean to lose his regime, to topple his regime by his own action. The same thing with Iran. As an Israeli, I am not concerned about Iranian threats or Syrian threats, and I think, by the way, that no friend of Israel in the U.S. should be concerned about Israel's well-being, and certainly should not involve Israel into any equation in the Middle East when it comes to preempting in Iran or preempting in Syria. Those are American interests which are on the line, not Israeli interests which are on the line. Israel has never been a top target for Iran. It's American power projection in the Persian Gulf, in the Indian Ocean, in the Middle East, which has been the #1 target for Iran, and therefore the U.S. should preempt against Iran. And those are American interests, which are threatened by weapons of mass destruction in Syria, and therefore the U.S. or the free world should preempt against Syria. But Israel should not be dragged into this equation, irrespective of Israel. The Middle East, the last 14 centuries means way, way, way before the State of Israel was established in 1948.
So this, I guess this brings us now to the so-called Russian proposal. There's a lot of speculation about, whether this was the result of a kind of an off-the-cuff remark by Secretary of State Kerry, or whether, in fact, the genesis of this proposal by the Russians to take over or make arrangements for the international control of the chemical weapons now stored in Syria by some sort of an organization, and a commitment by Assad not to use chemical weapons in the future, ultimately to destroy this huge stockpile of chemical weapons. Of course, here in the United States, everybody's breathing a sigh of relief, feeling like, well, this obviates the need to have any sort of a a military strike against Syria. There are skeptics. President Obama certainly is one of them. But you know, things are happening. Secretary of State Kerry is in Switzerland meeting with his Russian counterpart as we record this program. Do I number you among the skeptics, or are you somewhat encouraged? What are your thoughts about this recent development involving the Russians, the U.S., and the Syrians?
Well, to be skeptic, you have to have some hope. I don't have any hope in the Russian option, and therefore I'm not a skeptic. I think I'm a realist. It's very sad to witness the U.S., the leader of the free world, subordinating its own unilateral national security action to a multilateral decision initiated by Russia. Let's face it, Russia is the chief supporter of the Assad regime. Russia is the key supplier of advanced missiles and other weaponry to both Iran and the Assad regime. Russia is a chief supporter of rogue regimes throughout the Middle East and beyond the Middle East. Russia is the chief opponent, adversary of the U.S. in the UN Security Council throughout the Middle East, in the Persian Gulf, Asia, Africa, all the way to Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, to an extent in Mexico, at your own backyard. Why would anybody assume that that Russia would be an honest broker, which it has never been? But by the way, does not pretend even to be. But at the same time, the U.S. has provided both Iran and Syria more time to bolster their own position, and has made Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, and other allies of the U.S. much more antsy, probably much more panicky about their own survival. Israel is independent. We have the ability to defend ourselves. Our posture of deterrence is pretty robust here in the Middle East, but the Saudis have none of that. They depend solely on the U.S. And it seems to me that the U.S. should live up to its own capability. It's the U.S. which is the leader of the free world. And thank God, because of the virtues of the U.S., because of the values of the U.S., capabilities of the U.S., for the U.S. to relinquish that responsibility will not only mean to punish Saudi Arabia, but in the globalization of our world today, it would mean also a self-destruct policy. You cannot assume that there is such option as isolationism. In the old days, you could isolate yourself from events in the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, or even Europe. You cannot do it today. And again, the existence of multitude, scores, maybe even hundreds of Islamic terrorist sleeper cells on the streets of American cities and towns, and Boston is very much aware of that, does only document that reality, how small the world is and how vulnerable is the U.S. to the unpredictability. Refrain from action in the Middle East would unfortunately invite Islamic terrorist action on the U.S. mainland.
I should mention that Ambassador Ettinger is coming to us from Jerusalem through the use of Skype. We've encountered, some audio problems, which seem to clear up fairly quickly. I apologize for the interruptions periodically in the audio, and hopefully they will not continue. So, as we look at the Russian proposal, I gather that your feeling is it's not representative of a change strategically or philosophically by the Russians to be less supportive of these rogue regimes in the Middle East, that the Russians have not changed their stance insofar as the regimes that they continue to support.
Well, you know, on September 6th, Ambassador Samantha Power was not only ambassador to the UN, she is one of the mentors of President Obama when it comes to international relations. She is shaping Obama's international policy. And Samantha Power said on September 6th that she thought until recently that the Russian would have a hands-off policy from Syria once they realize that Syria is using chemical warfare. I mean, how gullible can anybody be assuming that Russia does not have appetite for rogue regimes who use chemical warfare? And by the way, the response by Russia to Samantha Powers and John Kerry and other policymakers in Washington and throughout the Western world was very, very tangible, namely supplying more missiles to Iran and stating that they are going to bolster their military presence near the shores of Syria. Iran was not deterred by a recent U.S. embrace of the Russian option, and Iran reacted to that by suggesting, should the U.S. attack Syria, Iran would feel free to retaliate against the U.S. Now, I don't take seriously Iran's threats against the U.S., but the fact is that they do not view the U.S. as exuberating, emitting much of an effective posture of deterrence. And that is the result of certain illusions which are continuously cultivated by some policymakers in the U.S. You can go back to the 4 years of Hillary Clinton. She traveled all over herself due to Mrs. Clinton's ingenious policy. I'm not aware of any such area. Secretary Kerry has been very busy, frequent flyer to the Middle East and back 6 or 7 times in the Middle East since he assumed the power. The Middle East has become much more volatile, not because of John Kerry, but it's a testimony to the failure of wishful thinking when it comes to demonstrating realism and consistency and determination and the will to confront rather than the eagerness to engage in negotiation.
The conversation we're having today about events in the Middle East and Syria sort of brings me back to your blog back on August 9th titled Israel's Bad Neighborhood, in which you asserted that the United States was trying to, quote, clip the wings of Israel, unquote, the nation that you described as the only reliable, predictable, stable, effective, democratic, and unabashedly pro-U.S. firefighter in the region. Has anything changed in your view about the U.S. pressure on Israel?
Well, it seems to me that one needs to be blind not to realize in view of the imploding Arab street around us. One needs to be blind not to realize that every day is highlighting the growing importance of Israel for very vital American national security interests. Only a few years ago, the U.S. used to refer to the port of Alexandria in Egypt as a friendly port for the Sixth Fleet. I think one needs to be delusional to assume that the U.S. could consider Port of Alexandria as a friendly port. The U.S. used to regard Mubarak of Egypt as a rock of Gibraltar. We know now that he has never been a rock of Gibraltar, and certainly nor are the Muslim Brotherhood or the military clique ruling Egypt right now. And this all occurs all over the world, all over the Middle East, at a time when the U.S. Withdraws from Iraq and from Afghanistan and cuts dramatically its defense budget. And the question is, how is the U.S. going to shore up the deficit of the short are mounting, while the Russian involvement and the Chinese involvement is deepening in the Middle East, and while the interests are at least as high as they were before, especially when it comes to the supply and the price of oil. And the only factor which could make up for the shorter American hand in the Middle East is Israel. Israel, as far as its capabilities of intelligence gathering, counter-terrorism, as well as conventional and non-conventional capabilities, battle tactics, which we share with the Americans on a daily basis, all the way, by the way, to our own infusion of research and development into the American defense industries. It has been Israeli modifications, Israeli upgrades into the U.S. defense industry, which has made that defense industry #1 in the world. We are like the leader or the world record holder of 100-meter race, which is sprinting with Nike, and therefore Nike sells very well. When we fly American combat planes, and when we use American night vision, and when we use American Homeland Security military systems as we do, and when we use American telecommunications during our day-to-day battle for our survival, the world knows those are the best systems in the world, or else Israel would not buy them. And those systems benefit from daily sharing with the Israelis of the battle experience and battle improvements. And I think this is what has made Israel a unique ally, a special ally. And by the day, more and more American policymakers realize that certainly those which are in the defense establishment, the armed forces, but also in the political realm as well as the public at large.
So, Ambassador Ettinger, would you say, as we look at the mood changing here in the United States, and with this so-called Russian proposal, there was this huge sigh of relief, I guess, here in America. Folks felt like, oh, this is good. We won't get involved with any kind of a military strike in Syria. Instead, we in the United States can focus on our problems, our difficulty in creating jobs, the issues involving our debt ceiling, health care. In other words, sort of looking inward at the kinds of issues domestically U.S. policymakers are trying to deal with. And does that, in your view, create any concerns about the U.S. support of Israel in the event of belligerence focused on the nation of Israel? Any concerns there?
Well, if we reach the messianic days of peace in the Middle East, no one would be more reassured and more gratified than Israel. But again, we have to talk realism and not wishful thinking. I wish that chicken would have lips and then I could kiss them. But unfortunately, they don't have lips, and therefore I cannot kiss them. And I think that planning, which is based on unrealistic assumptions, only leads to further and further damage. There is no such thing, unfortunately, as limiting our policy inwardly and detaching ourselves from the world and let the world get busy in its own street fighting and in its own civil wars. Unfortunately, this is not the case of our world today. And again, people in Boston know that very, very well. Why should Muslim terrorists hit the Boston Marathon? Why should Muslim terrorists blow up the Twin Towers as we just commemorated yesterday? This is the reality. And with more ambiguity in our policy, more vacillation in our policy, we further and further encourage more belligerence towards the free world. And therefore, again, we should be more realistic, more consistent, more determined, and prove to the rogue regimes in the Middle East and beyond that we, led by the U.S., are willing to preempt militarily in order to avert the wrath of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. Refraining from preemption would force us to much more vicious retaliation after suffering a blow which is absolutely unnecessary. Those who do not immune themselves doom themselves for a plague. It applies to our health. It also applies to our national security.
I think we've had a very interesting discussion today about the events involving Syria and the Middle East in general. I always like to conclude our program on, usually is a more optimistic tone. And you had mentioned previously about the partnership between Israel and the United States in terms of some of the technology that's developed in Israel or with the cooperation of Israeli firms. I noted in your boardroom post on August 16th, you mentioned that Israeli firms comprise 16% of the high-tech companies in Massachusetts, second only to the firms from India. As we shift our gaze over to the economy, what would you attribute Israel's high-tech linkage to Massachusetts, where our program is viewed? And do you see this Israel-Massachusetts linkage growing in the future?
Well, certainly Israel-Massachusetts is symptomatic of the potential Israel-US, namely growing joint ventures, growing interaction on a win-win, mutually beneficial basis. And the reason for Israel to become probably the world #2 center next to the US of high-tech innovations has to do with the nature of Israel. We are a nation under pressure, but we have learned to observe or to consider pressure not a negative element, but rather a challenge and an opportunity in disguise. Pressure can produce, and usually tend to produce, many positive elements. And those positive elements also have to do with high-tech innovations. We have in our military special high-tech units, whether it's Air Force or Naval or futuristic high-tech units. Those are units which undertake to fend off unexpected assaults in the near and the long run. However, once the graduates of those units retire from the military, they apply their very unique know-how to our commercial sector. And our commercial sector is highly integrated with the overall American high-tech. Hewlett-Packard owes 55% of its recent R&D innovations, research and development innovations, to Hewlett-Packard research and development centers in Israel. Intel, Microsoft, IBM, Cisco owe much of their success to their own research centers in Israel. Recently, Google acquired an Israeli company, Waze, for $1 billion, and Waze is making the Google mapping by far the number one in the world. And I can go on and on with this type of examples, whether it has to do with commercial high-tech, whether it has to do with agribusiness, agricultural research and development, water technologies, energy alternatives, space and photography innovations. We're talking about Israel, which is the most productive house of cutting-edge innovations, almost all of them benefiting directly American employment, American research and development, and American exports. And I believe that in many respects we are intertwined, we are mutually inclusive, both commercially as well as security-wise, and this largely has to do with our fundamental values. Both the U.S. and Israel adhere to the same basic Judeo-Christian values. We do face mutual threats. We do share joint interests. I don't know of any other natural alliance which is so closely intertwined, not even the U.S.-Britain, because U.S. is an outcome of an American rebellion against Britain, but that rebellion was largely based on embracing Judeo-Christian values.
It certainly is encouraging to reflect on the economic connections that benefit and which are positive insofar as the relationship between the United States and Israel, and certainly our high technology industries here in Massachusetts, which not only include defense contracting, but certainly pharmaceuticals, computer hardware, software. You mentioned Intel, Cisco Systems, and so forth. I read an article recently, Yoram, about, and I can't recall the source exactly, but the article concluded that Israel is continuing to make very good progress with its offshore oil exploration and production utilizing the fracking technology. Do you see progress being made in that space? And is Israel in the not too distant future going to be self-sufficient in oil?
Well, certainly we have a pretty bright future as far as natural gas at this time, mostly offshore. We should become net exporter by 2015, and that would be a blessing to our economy, which is growing without natural gas, but will grow even further with natural gas. According to the Texas, Houston-based company, Noble Energy, which is leading the exploration of natural gas in Israel, offshore exploration. There are oil deposits underneath the natural gas deposit. It hasn't been fully proven yet, but they claim that the signs are there. My only concern is that reliance on natural gas or oil should not diminish our thirst for more and more high-tech innovations. To a large extent, we developed our high-tech edge in the world because of shortage of
Yoram, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think on that positive note, we're just about out of time. Again, I want to thank Ambassador Ettinger for joining us from Jerusalem today, and to our viewers of International Forum. Thanks very much, and see you soon.
Thank you, and Happy New Year.
You as well.
This is Roy Cohen, producer and director of the International Forum show. Thank you for watching, and we welcome your comments to our email address, international.forum@yahoo.com.